I was out turkey hunting. We had started hiking at night, and had found our spots at around 4 AM. It was roughly a quarter of a mile from my hunting partner's shouting distance. It was pitch black, and we're trying to keep our lights off. I kept hearing human footsteps coming from almost random directions. After getting sufficiently uncomfortable, I heard a voice that sounded as if it were maybe 10 feet away from me. "Hello, Jack," said a voice. It sounded exactly like my hunting partner. I smelled the smell of coffee and Marlboro Lights. I replied, "Sup," but got no response. I flickered my lighter but didn't see anyone in the area. After saying that a couple of times, I shouted from my hunting partner, and he called back from around a quarter of a mile away. It started raining, and the distance and heat lightning would occasionally illuminate the field. I saw a tree that looked like a human figure, and after a few moments, it wasn't there. More footsteps around me. After a while, when the sun started to faintly show, I decided to take a break and was getting a bit creeped out. So I walked a quarter of a mile to my hunting partner's tree to ask him what he wanted. He said he hadn't left that spot and didn't walk up to meet me at any time in the morning.
My dad was stationed in Germany in the 80s in the US Army, and every 10 years or so they would do what's called a Winter Forger. Now, this basically means a giant war game where two sides compete against each other. My dad just happened to be there during one of these war games. Now, him and a buddy operated a tank, but due to some complication, they needed reinforcements, so they had to stay put and wait. They got bored and walked around to a small town nearby to get a bottle of apple corn, a type of alcohol. As they walked into town, they saw a young boy riding a bicycle. They stopped him and asked him the nearest place to go and grab a bottle, and he gave them directions. As they were following his directions, they saw a bar with a bunch of people in it. But for some reason, the kid never mentioned it, but they went in anyway. As soon as they got in, everybody stopped what they were doing and stared at my dad and his buddy. I mean, literally everyone, even the waitress. Now, after 5 seconds, everyone simultaneously started acting normal, like nothing ever happened. A little creepy. They asked to buy a bottle of apple corn. However, they refused to get any, instead giving them both free shots of it. After this, they kept insisting that they sat down to eat. They were passing around giant bowls of food to everybody. Somebody would eat a bit from the bowl and then pass it on to the next person. But my dad didn't want any food, they just wanted to buy a bottle of apple corn, but they constantly refused, offering only shots and food. Finally, they got tired of it. As they were walking around looking for somewhere else to get the apple corn, they passed a young boy again and asked him about the bar, and they refused to sell them the apple corn. The boy turns around and stammers, "You went to that place?" and immediately circles away from them as fast as you possibly can. My dad and his buddy look at each other like, what the hell? They're curious and they walk back to the bar and check it out again. But when they get there, the bar is completely empty and the lights are off. They stare inside through the glass and the chairs are all upside down on the table and there's cobwebs everywhere. The shelves behind the bar are completely empty and there's no alcohol there. They actually went around to check out the whole place to make sure it was the same, and sure enough it was the same bar they were in literally minutes ago, crowded with people. They then found another bar and bought some apple corn and quickly got out of there. To this day, my dad and his buddy swear that it's the creepiest thing that they've ever witnessed, and they still have no explanation.
We were camping in Sequoia National Forest, and our campground was as secluded as it gets. Just to reach it, you had to go on a treacherous one-way dirt road for over an hour. We arrived in the afternoon to find the campground only had 2 other inhabitants. The campground host, a little older lady, and a little dog. We set everything up, cooked dinner, and settled in and get some rest as the sun went down. Throughout the night, we would be awakened here and there by sounds. Nothing out of the ordinary, for camping in the middle of the dense wood. Just things like branches snapping and things moving in the trees. At 11 PM, we heard something going through the bolted trash cans around the campground. Knowing we were in bear country, I beat my car a few times and tried to scare it off. This happened a few times, and whatever it was kept coming back. As night went on, things got more and more strange. A meadow about 100 yards from where our tent was populated by a few wild cattle that earlier that day made some kind of scene for something terrible going down. We heard the sound of cows screaming bloody murder, like they were being torn apart. My initial thought was, shit, it's a bear or cougar pack of coyotes, or some kind of predator that was messing those cows up. It's obvious they were in distress. But after that, there was a noise I heard that I'd never heard any animal make before. It was a loud, deep howl, almost like a portamento, where it starts low and rises higher and higher in pitch. It was loud as hell. I could feel it in my chest vibrating. Needless to say, we were extremely freaked. It didn't stop there. Along with the sounds of cows dying, we also heard things like massive branches being torn off trees around us, something knocking against trees like with a rock or stick, and at one point, something big was walking around our camp. When we stuck a flashlight to the window in the tent, something massive went running by our tent, shaking the ground as it ran, as it was fast as hell. Eventually, all of this commotion died down, but not before that howl/shriek was let out again. This time further away in the woods. Of course, I didn't sleep that night. I anxiously waited for the sun to rise before inspecting the campground. Even though we heard trash being ripped and bottles clanking together, the trash cans weren't knocked over. They were still chained shut, which we thought was odd because a bear would have surely made more mess. We searched for bear and cougar tracks, but the only things we found looked like human tracks, like bare human feet, maybe a little bigger, but normal size. Not like those huge Bigfoot casts people have taken. I will say that I am far from a conspiracy theorist. I'm a huge skeptic. The thought of Bigfoot has always made me laugh. But still, as the day went on, and the prospect of spending another night there, now being the only campers present, became less and less appealing. We packed up quickly before the sun got too low, and got out of there. On our way home, whilst discussing what happened, my girlfriend pulled up various Sasquatch sounds on YouTube. Some were ridiculous, and some sounded identical to what we'd heard. Let's just say, I'm a little less skeptical now than I used to be.
I love going for night walks sometimes just because I dislike people, but I've been trying to get into shape for a while now, so nighttime's great. For that I have a route through some fields which are surrounded by cities, even highways. One major city skyline is visible from the paths I take on normal daylight and night. It looks really beautiful. Sometimes, however, we get really thick fog because of the mountain range. So one night I was out for a walk and it was super thick fog everywhere. It was fun at first. I couldn't even see to the end of the light post. I did have my headlamp on, but again I could barely see 1 foot in front of me, and I was walking on fairly unfamiliar paths. Usually you'd hear the sound of the highway close by because it's very busy all day and night. Usually fog can carry sound too, but at some point I noticed I didn't hear it at all anymore. I didn't even hear anything, in fact. There wasn't even wind. This was especially weird because the path that I was walking on had no trees, so I should have at least been able to hear something. So I got to a part that I knew well, and I decided to just keep on with my path and soldiered on. After a while, I heard a sharp whistling. That in itself wasn't too weird. People walk their dogs a lot in the fields and it wasn't too far away from where they do that. However, the whistling continued, and it sounded throughout the night, and it sounded as if it was getting closer to me and louder. It was somewhat melodic after a while, more like somebody trying to play a song than trying to catch a dog's attention or a person. This is a really weird part, the direction it come from, the open and very muddy fields. While it got closer and closer, sure, you could walk there, but you'd make plenty of noise and probably lose a shoe or so trying to wade throughout the mess. This was silent, just whistling. I tried to ignore it, but it creeped the hell out of me, so I just kept on walking, slowly getting colder and colder, despite walking up the hill and faster than usual. Now the whistling continued, and out of the corner of my eye, I could see something make out a silhouette, illuminated by my bobbing headlamp. That's when I started to really freak out. I live in Germany, and we have a tale here of the Nebelwerfer, which basically translates to fog whistlers. There have been in some historic accounts too. One of the major ones happened during the 30-Year War, where a small village very close to Düsseldorf in 1622 was surrounded by a heavy fog overnight. Whistling was heard all around it and throughout the night and the next day, and more than a dozen people were actually found missing, and never to be found again after that. It is said that these try and lure their unsuspecting victims closer. If you can whistle their favourite tune, you might survive. If not, they'll devour you. I'm not sure how much I believe this, but apparently they say right on the edge of how far you can just not see them from. They are also really stalk people and are out and about alone. Unless there's dire times, then they might come out, for example in war. So remembering all of this, it freaked the hell out of me and I sprinted home. It's the only experience I've ever had like it in my life. The part that really creeps me out is the silence. The fact that there were no sounds anywhere around me, nothing to indicate anybody was close or far, just whistling that was extremely close to me.
I was out for a long run, probably around 12 miles on dirt roads, through Iowa farmland, with plenty of abandoned barns and old buildings alongside it. As I'm running, I see this figure up ahead walking on the road. It's a fairly old man, well-groomed. If I compare him to anyone, he looks a bit like Jerry Sandusky, but greyer, with more black in the corner of his mouth and eyes. He was wearing a white sweatsuit and carrying a plastic bag over one shoulder. It looked heavy and full. The man smiled at me, and I smiled back, even though physically, I was distancing myself from him as much as possible. As I passed by him, I began to feel dizzy and nauseous. His presence just felt so wrong. His smile was off. I actually had to swallow back vomit, and it had begun to climb my throat. My adrenaline had gone up, and my pulse was hammering. When I looked back, a couple of meters later, he was gone.
I frequently go bushwalking all throughout the Blue Mountains, and I've done so since I was a kid with my dad. Sometimes for shorter walks I go alone. That could be dangerous. As a woman, I could have added the risk of being attacked or whatever, but I always carry a couple of knives on me, so I don't really feel that threatened. And I always bring a satellite phone. I just love and crave that feeling of being surrounded entirely by the bush. Anyway, around 5 years ago, I thought it would be a good idea to do an overnight walk by myself. Bad idea. The walk was fine. There was 3 or 4 groups of people who came by. That was only on the first day. I picked a little spot to stay overnight towards dusk. I cut a few ferns back and I had a space to stick my little one-person tent in. I was maybe 30 meters from the track, mostly out of sight and behind trees and such. There were lots of wildlife sounds as I drifted off to sleep. Though I thought there was a strange sound, I can only describe it as a bonding sound, like somebody was flitting through the bush right past me. But it was way too fast with too few steps for a person to be doing so. And if you've ever seen the bush in this part of Australia, you'd know that there isn't much space on the ground to walk freely if you're off the track. You have to at least wade through the bushes and ferns, etc. Now this was pretty unsettling, but I thought it was probably just something falling from a tree or whatever. The next morning, I had breakfast and packed up my things, and I kept on going along the track. I passed a couple of people going the other way. Then I was alone again for maybe half an hour. Then I heard the sound of a stick being broken, like from somebody stepping on it. The sound come from behind me and to my left, and away from the track. I turned around and nearly died to my feet. A fair distance into the bush was something standing, staring directly at me. I wanted to believe it as a person, but it wasn't. I can't judge the exact height, but it was obviously very tall. It may have been a skinwalker. Its skin was darkish grey or brown. It had this horrifically large head and these black eyes. I couldn't see a mouth or anything. Its arms were really long too. I was almost crying. Tears welled up in my eyes. I was completely frozen, staring at this. It was like my legs were locked in position. The longer I stared, the worse it would get, and I felt a heightened feeling of absolute dread. I've never felt this way before and haven't since. This fear kept on building up until eventually I could see my heartbeat in my veins in my vision. And I suddenly bolted. I sprinted away, continuing on the track. I ran and was way too scared to look behind me. Tears were streaming through my eyes as I was running away. I didn't stop until I actually caught up with those people going the same direction as me. They looked at me saying, "Oh my god, are you okay?" I was running for so long that I could barely breathe and said something, but I asked them if they could go the rest of the way with me. Now it took me 6 months before I started bushwalking again, and it's never been the same since.
When I was a teenager, I used to go out camping by myself. I had a spot where I liked that was a few fences from my grandparents' house in the middle of nowhere. One of the places I cut through was a pasture full of cattle. Around cattle, especially cattle unfamiliar with me, I tried to be careful not to spook them, but otherwise, cows are pretty easy going. This was about a mile away from my grandparents' house, and probably 2 from my destination. At the time, I slipped through the fence to find the cattle already freaked out. They were insanely agitated about something that I was not aware of, so I stayed well clear from them. I had a good time camping that night, and packed up next morning. As I went back into the pasture, however, there was this ridiculously bad smell. It smelled like a skunk had fought with something in a fertilized barrel of shit, and then broke the barrel. It was awful. I tried to look for the cows, to make sure I wasn't going to give them a nasty surprise, but they were nowhere to be seen. There were some bushes and trees, so I thought maybe they were just out of sight. Not long after, I found the cows. All of them had been shot and ripped apart. Someone had carefully shot them in the head with a bolt gun style thing, and eviscerated all of them. They had also dug this little shallow ravine and piled the bodies up. It was abominable. I hightailed it out of there to get my stuff and gear, but it was gone. I sat it on a rock about 100 yards away, easily within eyeshot, and when I get back, nowhere to be seen. I had been gone for a whole 5 minutes, and I think Usain Bolt wouldn't have been able to catch me on my way home. I never heard anything about those cows, and don't think I'll go back to that camping spot again.
When I was a little younger, I spent nearly all my time out in the woods by myself. I was slowly charting the acreage behind my family's house that was isolated by miles of back roads. One day around midday in September or October, I decided to take a long hike into the area we didn't own. We had a black lab, Sandy, who I brought with me for safety, and we walked to a creek that we followed some way back into the woods. After some distance, far enough that I no longer recognised my surroundings, the creek spilled into a small reservoir the size of a backyard pool. I remember clearly that it was a time of year where the leaves started to change colour. I remember the pool was black with silt and decorated by downed trees. Once I stepped around the very edge of the pool, there was a shift. Like if you messed with the contrast or saturation too much in a photo edit. I remember the colour, temperature, light, sound, and even objects appeared different to me. Now the water became very clear, and there was notably lush vegetation densely packed around the edge of the pool. I froze for what felt like a number of seconds before I felt something pulling me. My dog was really tugging at me on the leash. As I turned my head, everything snapped back to normal. However, my surroundings were now dark, and it was evidently sunset. Confused to this day, I've confirmed with family that I left the house after lunch, and based on the ground I covered, there was no way I'd been out in the woods for longer than 2 hours. Maybe even 1. Sandy was pulling me towards home, towards voices calling. Apparently I'd been in the woods for 8 hours. Now it didn't make sense with the time on my watch either. I eventually moved away but decided to return. The owners were gracious enough to let me have a walk around on my own. I ended up following the same path and relocating that creek again. It was dry season, but I found the area where it must have been, and I confirmed that there is no way that I could have been in the woods for that long. Now I'm a rational person, but I really have no idea what happened to this day.
Driving through the middle of Montana one night, I was going at about 100 miles per hour when I passed something on the side of the road that looked like a mangled body. I turned around at the next pass, came back, definitely a body. I put my lights on it and tried to call 911, but I had no cell phone reception. I got out of the car to see if I could pick up any reception, and the lights were still on. But there was nothing there except the blood spatters. I drove away quickly.
In 2014, I was driving at night on Highway 81 in SW, Oklahoma. It was around 2 AM. I hadn't seen another car for at least 30 minutes. I was on a stretch of road between Jiska and Rush Springs. In other words, I was in the middle of nowhere. I now come over a hill and see a car upside down in the ditch and a body just lying there, out of the car. It kinda looked like he was laying on his side asleep. I slam on the brakes and get out of the car and run over to him. I touch his shoulder and then realise the worst. He's died in a very nasty way. I could smell whiskey coming out of his gut. It was horrifying. He had no pulse. So I get my phone out and dial 911. I give them an estimate of where I am. They say the nearest help is at least 30 minutes away and I needed to wait with the wreck until they got there. Well, crap. I hung up the phone and looked around. I'm alone in BFE, Oklahoma. The only companion is a passed away man. Not knowing what to do, I took his hand and said the Lord's Prayer, then covered his face with a shirt that was hanging outside of the car. I was seriously shaking now. It was then that I heard the coyotes starting to turn up. If you haven't heard this sound, it's akin to small children being hurt badly. They wail and screech in what I think is a big circle around me and this man. It's been probably 15 minutes and no cars have showed up. I hear them on the highway. They are crossing just out of the headlights of my car. Now I have a decision. Do I get in my car and let them come up and tear on this guy, or do I find something to swing and protect his body? I ended up choosing the latter. I go to get the tire iron out of my trunk and go back to where this guy's laying. I guess I'm making a stand. I wait there for 5 minutes and I hear them running around. It's totally dark. I am not truly in control of this situation. Something very primal comes over my brain. It's akin to rage, along with a heavy dose fear. Whatever was gonna happen, I was gonna have to fight like crazy to try and survive now. At this very moment, I see car lights. Finally, a car shows up, and wouldn't you know, it's a Pontic God AM, full of meffed up country boys. They pull over and look at me, see the dead guy and the car. I say, guys, he's dead. There are coyotes circling us now. They go to their cars and pull out several handguns and a couple of flashlights. They're really excited to be able to hopefully kill these things, although they were almost as unnerving as wild animals out in the dark. A couple of minutes pass and we hear a siren off in the distance. The guy says, "It's the cops," and they jump in the car and haul ass. I'm alone now, me and this poor man. 60 seconds later, a state trooper shows up, then 2 deputies, then finally 3 city cops, and then an ambulance. They took the guy over and pronounced him dead. They asked me 100 questions asking about what I was doing out there. Eventually they said, "Thanks, you can go now." I left and started driving down this pitch black road again, knowing that I could have been in a battle for my life then.
My cousin is with the Forest Service in Montana/Wyoming, and I decided to go up there with her to literally test the waters. She does hydrology and has to ride out into the middle of nowhere to test streams and do snow runoffs to ensure there's no contaminants. So I thought it sounded fun and wanted to do a bit of a tour with her. We were going to camp out there for 2 nights, so we packed up all our gear in saddlebags and saddle bodies and started out. The first day and night was amazing. Beautiful scenery and amazing air quality. It really is so peaceful out there. I love that area and wish to go back there more often. Anyway, we started out on the second day, and my cousin said, "Do you want to see something weird?" "Of course," I said. And she led me on a bit of a side journey to this tiny little ravine. We ended up travelling about 2 hours away from the actual path. At the very end of this land, she dismounted and told me to get off the horse as well. We tied them to a little clearing, and I follow her to this tiny wildlife path and bring our little rechargeable radio. This is the one that you can plug in or wind up, and it also acts as a lantern if you need it to, but that really kills the batteries. So out here in the middle of nowhere, there is a huge coil of wire sticking out of the ground. The wire itself is not wildly large, like some buried transmission wire, but small, like a 10 or 12 gauge wire from a house. It trailed off into the bushes and the trees, so naturally I decided to follow the damn thing out of curiosity. My cousin trails behind me as I do, and after coming straight up from the ground, it strung across limbs of trees, then back to the ground, snakes around a rock, and finally deadens into an outlet. The outlet is mounted on the side of a desk. It looks like a school teacher's desk from when I was growing up, with a metal base and a pseudo wood/plastic topping. No chair, no building, nothing. Just this outlet and the desk. I'm staring confused as hell at this desk, in a forest in the middle of nowhere. My cousin pulls the cord and plugs it into the outlet, and it lit up and started blaring static. That wire was fed from somewhere. Now the place we had had no road access and no buildings for many, many miles. With no other people around, and still a live outlet. Weird as shit.
I had an experience that really never left me. It was in the woods of Portola Valley. I frequently camped by a stream, maybe 3 or 4 weeks in total camping time if you added it all up. And there's always the sound of the stream in the background, as well as gentle wind, cracking sounds and occasional animals, normal animal sounds. Well, one night I was woken up by a nightmare of a black/greyish creature standing by a campsite, not doing anything, just standing there. It had no features, it was just a dark colour. I don't usually have paranormal fantasies or dream this way at all, so it was a first and very scary for me. I was so scared that I woke up startled. I wake up and then things just don't feel right. I then panic a bit and start to wake up my SO and tell him I had a nightmare. As I'm waking up, I had to notice that there's no sound, as in 0 sounds, not even the sound of air moving. The creek sound is gone, wildlife, everything. The entire campground is silent. No, I've never felt such a feeling of dread before, and I've never felt it since. I tell him that we need to go now. The more I think about it, the more creepy it feels. Thank God that he was actually listening to me. He had some similar experiences growing up, and he's very scared by the lack of sound. We pack up and leave in probably less than 10 minutes. That feeling of sticky, aggressive oppression doesn't leave us until we're completely back in town. This is the stuff that's going to sound the craziest. My car would not go over 15 miles per hour the whole way down the hill. It wasn't in second gear. No, we weren't higher. And my SO and I kept trying everything, and I kept saying we need to get out of here now. As soon as we got back to town, it went back to normal. To this day, I have no explanation for it whatsoever.
I was at my in-laws' house for Thanksgiving in Montana. They live about 60 miles south of the Canadian border. They are what I would call comfortable survivalists and live way off the grid. No TV, no cell reception, too far up in the mountains for that. Great people, just don't like towns, and my wife was homeschooled. I decided I would go for a morning deer hunt on Thanksgiving. It's a great location for it, as they are right in the middle of prime deer, elk and bear country. Their house borders national forest land on 3 sides, so pretty easy to find yourself in the middle of nowhere, because you're already there. My father-in-law insists I leave the house at the crack of dawn. Where I hunt, they don't start moving until around 8 or 9. But of course I agree with him and head out before light. I've got a headlamp on, walking down a narrow trail in thick coverage, and can see about 10 feet in front of me. It's super cold but no snow, and dark as hell, and 20 miles from the nearest town. My father-in-law says that we have about 25 minutes hike, and that we'll get to a small curvy valley that is a newly finished logging project, perfect hunting area for deer, as there is minimal coverage and you can see a mile down the valley. The trail meets up with the rugged logging road, and as I walk up, I can see large slash piles from the logging project all over the place. I find a good spot and sit and listen. I'm sitting there and it's getting light, looking around for deer. To my right, 200 yards away, there is a slash pile with something moving around it. I pull up my little binoculars and look. There's a deer with its legs in the air covered in blood and dirt. I start to feel the hair on my neck straighten out. The deer disappears inside the pile of branches, and then I see a mountain lion come out from the pile, nose red with blood. He scrapes all around the area for a few minutes. I'm guessing he smelled or sensed me, because he was walking around in little circles and looking up into the air. I didn't know what the hell to do. I was kind of panicked because they're very territorial and will definitely attack people. So me being a cool guy, I fired my gun in the air and walked back to my in-laws' place in circles. I did see the lion run off, but still, it was the scariest walk I've ever been on. And of course, played it cool when I got back, and told my wife what happened that night.
I hunt a lot, and my father has property in South Texas, and I love going out there to spend a lot of time hunting. So one weekend, it was mid-November and really cold out. I decided that I would head to my blind late afternoon and stay there throughout the night. When I arrived to the blind, I hadn't seen any animals on the way at all, and we're talking like a good 2 miles of walking and not even seeing birds. I didn't think anything of it since it was winter, but of course I should have still seen some birds and whatnot. As I arrived to the blind, I was setting up everything and pulled out this bottle of doe yoring, trying to pick it up and lure a buck with it. Now, from the very moment that I opened it, I started hearing movement on this right ridge behind the blind and kept trying to look out of the small window to see anything. All of a sudden, there was this really loud thud that hit the side of the blind. I jumped and thought maybe a deer had fallen off the ridge and hit the blind. I couldn't see anything, so I opened the door and saw a huge rock and a nice dent in the side of the blind. Now something threw this rock that must have weighed close to 30 pounds. I grabbed my rifle and said screw this. Most likely out loud, threw open the blind door, jumped 6 or 7 feet to the ground and started running back to camp. Now nothing else actually happened to me that night. I didn't hear any coyotes yelping, howling or anything at all. I got to my truck the next morning because I felt like I was going to get attacked. Now I've only gone back a few times the last couple of years and I can't shake this feeling of being watched. Nothing has happened yet, but I'm very on edge and I hope nothing else comes from this.
I live in the only house down a country road. Everything else is pasture land and national forest for several miles. At 3 AM, my 3 large dogs go absolutely nuts barking, which sends my husband flying out of bed to check out our livestock, assuming we had coyotes in the yard. Before we could even get our shoes on, we hear muttering on our front porch. He grabs his rifle, and whoever it is starts knocking on the door with no real urgency, but more like a casual visitor. He had my cell phone already dialing the cops, and my husband slid the peephole. A woman around her late 20s, early 30s, was standing outside, patiently waiting a few minutes, and knocking gently on the door, not fidgeting or nervous nor being aggressive. My husband said, "Ma'am, the cops are on their way. If you need help, they'll be here in just a few minutes, and you're welcome to sit on the swing right there and wait. But if there's anyone there with you, we're armed in here, and will not hesitate to shoot if anyone tries getting into this house." He said that, and she kind of smiled. Not creepy, but like she was glad her knocking woke someone up. "That's okay, sir. I just wanted to let you know that the thing in the woods is coming, and that he'll be here soon. Good luck," he said. She turned around and walked down the driveway, like she didn't have a care in the world. The cops looked all over the place and couldn't find her, and it's a 10-minute drive to our driveway from the main road, with no houses until you get into town, another 20 minutes away, and it freaked me out for weeks.
I grew up in a very rural area in the deep south and spent most of my time riding my horse alone in the national forests and expansive private properties. There was an abandoned house that was about 2 miles ride through the woods from me, and I often rode it by myself on journeys through the woods. Sometimes I tied up my horse outside and went in and explored inside, but there was really nothing of interest. There was just trash and things like electric bills from the 80s. I think an old woman used to live there based on some pictures that I found. Time went on and I went away to college, taking my horse with me. I no longer rode past the abandoned house now. After graduating college, my horse and I moved back to home for a little while. I decided to go back and explore it again. So I rode my horse that same 2 miles through the deep woods to get to this house, which is by itself probably about 1,000 feet from a lonely gravel road that cuts through the forest. It is very secluded and almost creepy. The house is about 3 miles from a paved road. I am less brave than I used to be, so when I entered the home, I felt out of place and slightly scared, but I used my cell phone light to explore the rooms anyway. Now a lot of it was as I remembered, but right as I was about to leave, I found a calf skeleton in the corner of the entry room. I have no idea how this calf got shut up inside the building. The doors were firmly shut as I approached. Also, the screen door opened one way, while the actual door opened the other, so it's impossible for both to be opened at once for some creature to accidentally wander in. Furthermore, the nearest cow pastures are miles away from the home. I left the abandoned house with the image in my head burnt there forever.
We were out hunting with a group of guys. We were all 100 yards from each other. The sun had set, and the darkness was quickly settling in. We called it a night, and I started getting down out of the trees when I heard a twig snap. I froze, thinking it was a deer, and not wanting to scare it. After sitting for a few minutes, this blood-curdling howl comes from where the twig snapped. We don't live in an area with wolves, like, at all. We have coyotes, but they don't make the same sound. My phone started blowing up, with the other guy asking if I'd heard it. Yep, it's nearly under my tree. It was so loud I could almost feel it in my chest. After about a half hour of silence, I gathered all my bravery, and I bailed out the tree, armed with a knife, and made my way to the group. We never saw it or heard it again after that. It was one singular howl in an area that doesn't have wolves, on an island we've hunted on for 10 years, and never had anything like that happen. I still haven't quite figured out where it came from, and still get goosebumps from thinking about it.
I was hiking through the remnants of a remote, long-abandoned town and the surrounding area. To get as far into the woods as I was, you had to cross fallen trees over creeks at least 3 times. I had just crossed the 3rd bridge and was about 5 miles in, and something blue caught my eye ahead of me. There was a man in his 60s at least, wearing blue satin pyjamas, sitting in a tree. The closer I got to him, the louder he laughed. It wasn't a maniacal laugh, but it set off more than enough alarm bells in my head nevertheless. He wasn't wearing any shoes either, yet he looked well groomed and clean. I gave him a friendly nod as I passed, and he just kept laughing. Then it stopped. I turned and he was gone. There was no branch cracking, plants rustling, leaves disturbed, nothing. He was just gone. Hello everyone. Thank you for watching. I want to say a massive thank you to my friend Mortismedia for featuring on this video. Make sure you go and subscribe to his channel and check out his content. There's also a part 2 to our collaboration. I'll leave a link in the description, so make sure you go and check that out as well on Mortis's channel. Thank you again Mortis, and thank you everyone for watching. I'll talk to you soon my Insomniacs.